Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Richey and Nora explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Richey. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Welcome back, Nora. It's been a little bit since we've done this.
It has. You've been in many places and I've been in many places. And now we're back. We're back in our home studios having a lovely time.
Exactly. I feel like we've had our world tour and now we're back for a little while, which is nice. So, it's good. It's good. So, but it definitely feels like, oh yeah, we've been around the world a little bit. Both of us.
We have, absolutely.
So,
and as part of that, we've seen a lot of things, right? We've met a lot of good people. We've had some really interesting experiences. One of the things I always say whenever I travel, especially when I travel and do teaching and work out with fitness people and hang out with them is, it doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter what country you're from.
Yeah.
Like there is all of us who do this kind of work, this kind of movement-based work are just tend to be kind of fun people on the interesting side, pretty lively. And I always have a good time. And I always feel like, these are my people. Like I can find my people anywhere as long as I'm in a Pilates environment or a movement environment. Like, oh yeah, I get this. And we get each other and we can nerd out about whatever little thing we're nerding out about at the moment.
Yep. Absolutely. I've found myself doing that, talking to a group of people that I was in Japan and, speaking a different language and not my language. And it was fascinating sort of to see the similarities in what we've all seen. And you and I both know that the body types are very different between a European body versus an Asian body, or even an African body or a Latin body. Body types can be very different. So when you and I teach in Asia a lot, and it's interesting sort of to talk to them about their bodies. And, they say, well, we're seeing a lot of this. And I'm like, oh, well, let's dive into that. Why are you seeing that? I'd be like, oh, okay, I can see this. And, you start breaking things down and it just makes for fascinating conversation.
One of the things I say, this is we're getting into the shoulder shortly, people, but this is a moment. So we're going to take a little moment. One of the things that I say a lot to my Korean teachers and a lot of my teachers in Asia is, in many ways, I find that their eye is more precise. And this is, don't take this the wrong way, anybody out there, but because there are somewhat less variability in terms of body types, and just, even just appearance, but there's just a little bit it's just less options. When I go to a class in America or I teach a group in America, I've got every body type typically in there, right? A little tiny skinny thing with a flat back. And I've got somebody who's much bigger with a deep lordosis. I'm like, I've just got everything.
Yep.
And I go to Korea or I go to China. I'm sure you had the same thing in Japan. And it's kind of like there's a range, but it's much smaller.
Yes.
And so that's interesting because my Koreans have such a good eye. Like their ability to pick out tiny differences is just oftentimes better on average than a lot of the teachers I teach here, because we're used to looking at a much broader spectrum and don't necessarily need to make such fine distinctions. So anyway, that's just one of those moments that I really enjoy being there and seeing that precision, seeing that specificity.
Yeah. I think they're also so focused on trying to be perfect.
Yeah.
And that's just their mindset is they want everything to be very precise. So when they look with a very precise eye.
Yeah.
Very precise. And it is interesting teaching someone who has that eye already sort of fine-tuned in a way that we don't always see everywhere where we teach. So it's almost, rewarding to be, oh, wow, okay. You're starting at a different level, not better, not worse, just a different level. And it's like, okay, let's even, refine that even more, fine tune everything. It's really fascinating.
It is. And with that in mind, with that level of precision and in mind, we're going to talk a little bit about the shoulder. We haven't talked about the shoulder a whole lot on this show. And we wanted to just dive into it. And particularly for a couple of different reasons. I've been working with a couple of clients and then having Tom McCook on in one of our last episodes. He's got some shoulder things going on. And one of the things that occurred to me as I'm working with a lot of clients with shoulder issues is, number one, they're really, really, really common. Again, they don't have to be diagnosed. There's not necessarily always a pathology that's been studied, but there's just an imbalance there. Like it just gets a little tight. It gets a little, it gets a little sticky. And I often find that, especially because most of us are one-handed, right? We're right hand dominant or left hand dominant, that we just end up with a slight asymmetry in terms of how we hold our glenohumeral joint and how we hold our scapula. And oftentimes over time, that can just lead to wear and tear, neck tension, shoulder tension, other kinds of issues.
Yeah, I completely agree. But before we get into that, I do want to remind everybody, do us a favor, hit the like button, hit the follow button, especially hit the follow button. Please, please, please give us lots of thumbs up, 5-star review on whatever platform you're using. We really appreciate it. You can always get in touch with us at movingconvos@gmail.com or hit us up on Instagram, Moving Convos, or on Nora's or my. You can always DM us. We'll get back with you. So now that that's out of the way, I have a train of thought, and I want to know what you're thinking about with this. The shoulder has, in my mind, a lot of issues or a lot of imbalances. For one, because of the amount of mobility that we have in it.
Yeah.
Okay. Unlike the hip joint, where it's pretty much just one joint. This is multiple. This is 4 joints that are working together to try and create a symmetrical movement. And even the scapula itself, I think we talked about, has what's like 17 muscles connecting to it. I mean, there's so much going on with that. And with the amount of mobility that we have to have, that it really sets us up for classic imbalances, because when there's that many muscles connecting to a single bone, if one gets too tight or one gets too loose or one gets out of it creates a weirdness, a funkiness that can create some imbalance just inherently. So that's sort of where my mindset was the greater the amount of mobility, the more we need it to be stable and the more chance for imbalance to occur. What do you think?
The other thing too, for sure. Absolutely. Like it's just a complex area. And the other thing I want to bring up is, unlike some other parts of our body, we use the shoulders and the upper body very differently on the 2 sides.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm aware of that when I'm typing or working my computer or, whatever, but I'm really aware that when I'm driving and I have both hands on the wheel, I'm a good 2 and 10 person or whatever it is. And I've got my hands on the wheel and I realize like one hand's pulling down and one's coming up. Like, just like that's the feeling in my body, is that twist, just having my hands on the wheel. And I've really got to work just driving to keep that left shoulder for me kind of down and back, because it just wants to come up and forward. My right one's happy being stable where it is. I'm right hand dominant. I do a lot more things with my right hand. I'm a lot stronger on my right side. And so feeling like so much of what we do is one-sided. Like I was just getting an EKG the other day, or actually an echocardiogram the other day, I should say. And I was talking to the sonographer, right? And I said, because I worked with a lot of them, they all have shoulder issues. And I said, do you have any shoulder issues? Just because I'm curious. And she said, yeah. She said, I have nerve stuff. I've got all these issues. And looking at what she'd had to do, that one hand is on the computer. Her right hand is on the computer because that's in front of her. Her left hand is holding this wand in a variety of static positions for a period of time.
Yep.
And those are classic things and classic reasons why the shoulders get imbalanced, is because we don't use the 2 sides symmetrically most of the time.
I was talking with a client of mine who is a dentist.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing, especially for that, because you're working in a space this big.
Exactly.
For a long period of time.
Yep.
And your body starts to get very curled in on itself. And they all have shoulder, they all have neck issues because they're always like this the whole time for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And, she and I were talking, she said, I wish I had chosen a different profession sometimes that wouldn't be so but, in this space, she said, no one ever tells you that when you're getting into the business. And I think a lot of jobs inherently have either a right hand, a left hand dominance, or, a postural issue or whatever. I mean, we've seen it with mechanics,
Yeah.
my dad, he was a mechanic early in his career. And even though he went into more of the sales side of things, one forearm is still bigger than the other. And it's because you do this thousands and thousands of times with a screwdriver or a wrench.
Yeah.
It's going to create some imbalances.
Yeah, and it's like I talked to my dental hygienist, the same thing, right? And they're sometimes spending more time in your mouth, if you will, than a dentist.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, how do you manage to not have troubles? Because she really doesn't. I said, no. She says, I'm pretty comfortable. She runs, she hikes, she's very gross motor physically active the rest of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And she says that's what keeps her going. She says if this is all she did and then she came home and sat on the couch, she'd be a wreck. But she doesn't. She's very, she's very, like, again, gross motor, big movement, getting the circulation going, and that really works for her.
Yeah, yeah, and it makes sense. It makes sense. The more you move, the better.
Yeah.
Just in general in life, the more we can move, the better. And almost like the movie WALL-E, a lot of society has moved less and less and less and less until you're just that sort of, blob sitting on a couch for a lot of your life
Using your
because
fingers.
you're using your fingers. You're sitting at a desk. You're sitting in the car.
Yeah.
You're sitting at the dinner table. You're sitting, watching TV, and everything's sort of in the same position. It's like, oh, we got to move. You got to move your body.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So thinking about the shoulder, right? We've got our 4 joints of the shoulder. So this will be a little intro, right? We've got our sternoclavicular joint, where our clavicle meets our sternum, right? And that's the one place that this whole giant mobile structure attaches to the central axis of the body, right? That's kind of the stabilizing point. Everything else is mobile. That is kind of where things connect into a stable situation.
Yep. And I was just teaching anatomy course in Japan. And the thing that I reminded people, I said, think about it. That's the one axis that your entire shoulder girdle and arm moves off of. That's it.
Yep.
That's the one bone on bone ligament structure that everything moves around. Everything else is muscular that attaches to the torso. So, yeah, it's an incredibly important joint.
Yes, and again, it can be stable, which is great. But sometimes, if somebody particularly has a car accident or another situation where it gets dislocated or something, in my experience, that just discombobulates the entire upper body. Because so many things attached to that and are really dependent on that stability. Much like we think about our hip, being dependent on a stable acetabulum. When that gets unstable, or a stable SI joint, when those get unstable, everything that tries to attach to that is trying to figure out how to manage itself, right? And often not very successfully.
Yeah. Something most people don't realize is the amount of calcium that actually is in that ligament structure to make it stronger. It's an incredibly strong, and we rarely see it dislocate, unlike some of our other ligaments in our shoulder. We don't see it often, but if it does, the amount of instability that's created in that shoulder, is off the charts. So just something to think about.
Yeah. So sternoclavicular joint, right? So take a moment and move that, because the other thing too is how much that can move, right? It moves forward and back and up and down, and then kind of rotates even. So there's this little all this mobility, and then notice how it takes the rest of the shoulder with it, right? It's not the only thing moving. When it moves, everything goes with it. So then we've got our acromioclavicular joint, which is not an area with a lot of motion, and we'll kind of leave that be. And then looking at our glenohumeral joint, how our humerus moves in our glenoid fossa. There we go. Brian's got that up on the screen for those of you who are watching us on YouTube or want to take a peek at that. It's about the 14-minute mark. And so when you're thinking about the glenohumeral joint, and again, Brian's going to just be moving that a little bit, you've got a big giant ball. It's kind of like the size of a golf ball or a handball, and a little tiny socket. The glenoid fossa is like maybe the size of a quarter, depending on how big you are. So there's not a lot of integrity in that joint. All of the integrity comes from the soft tissue, from the muscles, the ligaments that surround that joint. So it's not an inherently stable joint. And in fact, I've worked with several clients who've had strokes, and the side they've had the stroke on that's paralyzed, literally that humeral head falls out of the socket, and you see kind of a little stair step. Look, so the shoulder goes like there's a little divot, and that's because the muscular support isn't there. Without that, it just falls out of the socket.
Yeah, that's the only thing holding this into this. If it wasn't for the muscles, there's no real ligament, unlike a lot of our other joints that we have in our body that, you have two bones to join together with a ligament, or, a ligament like our knee, for instance, where there's a ton of ligaments holding it together. Only thing holding this here is muscle. We have the labrum, which is a little bit of ligament-like, but it's just sort of helping to make the glenoid fossa a little bit deeper. But if all those muscles, like you said, were not active, it would just fall out of its joint. It would just literally fall.
Yep. So labrum and joint capsule, but it's not like the ligamentous joint capsule we have around the femur.
No, not at all.
It's just not, doesn't work the same way. We don't have that kind of really stabilizing structure. Because why? Because we're trying to move that arm in every possible version, right? We're trying to maintain a lot of mobility there.
Yep.
So there really isn't that stabilizing force near the joint with the ligaments.
Yeah. Yeah, the amount of range of motion and mobility that we have in the shoulder compared to the hip, for instance, where they're both considered ball and socket, unless you're a professional dancer, you're not going to get anywhere near the amount of range of motion in your hip that you can inherently from the shoulder.
Right. That you start with and kind of end with without an injury in the shoulder. It's like, you can't do this with your legs unless you're trained for a long time. You can't really do this with your legs either, and you trained for a long time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's just kind of normal range of motion in the shoulder.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've always found it interesting that with the shoulder joint, again, with the amount of mobility that we have and the fact that it's all muscle, all it takes is for one thing to get a little off.
Anything.
And it could be any of all of it.
Yeah.
Just a little bit off. And suddenly you can have issues. And the next joint that we're about to talk about is the one that's purely muscle, which is the scapulothoracic joint. And that's where our scapula literally attaches to our rib cage. And that's the one that we see so much issue with, because if that's not working right, if that's in the wrong place, then it leads to everything going out of whack.
Right. And so so Brian and I were talking about this, and we both have our own ways of messing with this. I find most people have no idea where their scapula is or what it's doing. Like, I use a silly analogy of we're basically like paper dolls that are printed on one side. We have an awareness of what's happening here, not much awareness of the back, and we really don't think about the sides at all, right? So that's just a usual way that our nervous system reflects who we are and what we're doing. So the scapula, this kind of mystery spot. And a lot of times just how the scapula sit on that rib cage, one up, one down, one in, one out, one pulled forward, that influences and is influenced by all of the muscles, those 17 muscles that attach into that whole shoulder girdle.
Yep.
And the scapula needs to stay somewhere depending on what you're doing, and it will do whatever it needs to do that. So it might end up forward, it might end up back, it might end up pulled together. It'll do whatever it needs to do to stabilize in the best way that it can. But there are many, many options. The scapula, unlike, for example, the femur or the hip's got it's here. The pelvis is here. It's got a little tiny bit of mobility. And otherwise it's here. The scapula is like, woo, where do you want me?
Yep.
Yeah.
And whatever we do regularly, whatever we do habitually becomes our norm. So if I sit, and I see this all the time, I can usually tell what side of the sofa someone sits on, what side they carry their bag on, all sorts of things, because you can see where that shoulder, where that scapula sits. Or, you have a child and you carry them on this side. How do you know? Well, you can see their whole shoulder, their hip, everything is different on one side. And it's because of that habit, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of repetitions. and nothing to correct it.
Right. Yeah,
And that's
because we
the
don't.
issue.
Yeah, because we don't think about this area consciously,
Hmm.
really. I mean, you can, but a lot of people don't ever think about this. They're just doing what they're doing, and they're going through their day, and they're managing as best they can. So when we think about balancing and training the shoulder, we think about two things primarily. We think about glenohumeral congruency, so figuring out
Hmm.
how that humeral head is moving and supported in that socket, because that'll really throw things off if it's too loose in there, or is it moving
Hmm.
appropriately. And then we also look at where is the scapula sitting on the rib cage and
Yep.
how is it moving? Is it moving appropriately? Are they moving symmetrically? Is one moving faster or one not moving at all? Is one stuck? All those situations. That's kind of where we're always thinking about in terms of that is what's the glenohumeral joint doing and what's the scapula doing?
Yeah. Yeah. It's something that I find interesting is that when we make some simple corrections, how they can affect our client. Because even when you were saying, when we were just talking about the scapula, when I've helped correct someone's posture even a little bit, especially my men, they will often tell me my suits don't fit anymore
Uh-huh.
because they're used to them fitting a certain way. And if they're, kind of hunched over and, rounded forward because they're sitting at their desk all the time and whatnot, and suddenly their scapula is sitting in a different place. Suddenly their suit doesn't fit the same way. It fits differently. Or if it's tailored to them because they've had it cut a certain way, they have to get it recut, retailored. And they say, but I don't want to do that to every one of them. I said, sorry, you're in better shape now. We've actually corrected something. We've actually put your scapula back where it needs to be.
Yeah.
And I think that we were just talking a few minutes ago about the fine tuning our eye. I think being able to see where that scapula sits is incredibly important, because then we can break down, okay, what muscle might be tight, what muscle may not be strong enough. Because I think we can lump into certain things, like the lower trapezius is often underdeveloped,
Mm.
and the upper trapezius is normally always overdeveloped or tight. But it takes that eye to be able to see, where is that scapula really sitting?
And how is it moving?
Yeah. Is it moving
Yeah.
properly?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are we seeing the natural scapulohumeral rhythm, or is something jamming? Is something, not quite, is there a hitch in their giddy up, so to speak?
So when I work with the shoulder, and I've played with this a lot of different ways, but a lot of times I'll start with looking at do they have glenohumeral congruency? So is the glenohumeral joint working as it should? And that's
Mhm.
kind of where I start. So what I mean by that, Brian, would you bring the bones back? Just again, I know you guys don't all have some. This is just audio, but basically, if you picture the head of the humerus like a little tennis ball, and you picture a little tiny glenoid fossa, the idea there is that as that ball rolls, it stays centered in the socket. So the ball may change position, but it's not rolling forward or back or up or down out of the socket. Does that make sense? It's kind of like the center of the ball still stays organized or oriented to the center of that glenoid fossa. And again, on YouTube, 23 minutes, you got a really good visual of this one. And what you'll find is if a client is hypermobile, particularly, and I see this a lot in my swimmers, in some of my
Yes.
dancers, and people who do a lot of overhead work.
Mhm.
Do you see it in? I'm trying to think
Rock
about my pit.
climbers,
Rock climbers. Oh,
because they
yeah.
hang and literally pull it out of the socket because they're just literally holding on by their fingers and letting their bodies hang. I see it a lot with
Right.
them.
Okay. I was trying to think, and I was thinking pitchers because I worked with a few pitchers, and
Yep.
they were also pretty loose. Even tennis players, I'd imagine, although I haven't checked that on them. But so what happens there is that basically that humeral head is no longer staying in the socket, right? It's like it can be a little bit hanging low. It can be a little bit pulled forward, a little bit pulled back. It doesn't have the muscular support, and it has too much mobility. And that's where, so the first thing we're get congruency, trying to really get that support and that balance going again in the glenoid fossa.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's probably the most important thing when I've worked with people like this. best example I can give you is the rock climber that I worked with. He was 24 years old and was told he needed a double shoulder replacement.
Ew.
Because he'd been for years in this position with his humerus elevated and pulling it out of the socket, literally hanging by the muscle, but pulling it away from the glenoid fossa. And he had overstretched all of those muscles. And again, he had seen various, medical professionals when he came to us. But we were able to get him to the point where he didn't need to have a shoulder replacement. We got all those muscles back to being where they needed to be. And for the humeral head to sit properly in the glenoid fossa. And I found that was the most important piece. And to eliminate the cause. I think that's the thing that we have to remind ourselves about is I had to tell him, no more hanging. Don't be doing that.
Yeah.
Because you're just going to remind the body of what's negative, what's bad. I was once told that for baseball pitchers, especially, that for them, they know when their arm goes, when they throw a pitch, there's a natural point at which it comes across the body and sort of bounces off of the body in the opposite hip. And there's sort of a springiness within the joint. That as they throw, it comes across and it bounces a little bit. However, when that rotator cuff begins to lose its integrity and stretches out too much, they find the arm just sort of hangs and doesn't have that elasticity within the joint anymore. And you can see it beginning to happen. And eventually they do it and their arm literally just hangs. And that's when they know they've lost that integrity in the joint.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So join us at home. You're just going to thinking like, this is crazy. What is she talking about? What does this mean? Right. Because this is subtle. Again, as we sometimes do, we dove right into kind of the subtleties of this, but a lot of times what I'll have somebody do is just take their hand kind of around the top of their shoulder. So like basically my hand is just around the top of my whole shoulder. And I'm just going to roll my arm forward and back. So internally and externally rotate the humerus. I'm trying not to move the scapula. This is just looking at the humerus. And basically I'm seeing if that humeral head roughly, which is kind of under my fingers, is pushing forward and pushing back or staying more or less in place. And this is super simple. This is not complicated. And if you can learn to feel that on yourself, if you've got an unstable shoulder, and learn to really keep just with that simple rotational action of the arm, just internal and external rotation of the arm, and keep that humeral head centered. As you do that, you're training the rotator cuff, particularly the subscap and the teres minor and the infraspinatus, to really get to maintain some of that support and stability. And what I find for a lot of my clients who start to work with that is they get unbelievably fatigued in some part of the rotator cuff, typically in the back, like the infraspinatus. They'll feel like they get so tired in those back of the shoulder muscles when they do that. And a lot of that is just because those muscles are not used to working in that range. They've kind of given that range up, allowed the humeral head to slide forward. And it takes some work and some time and some effort to get that strength back and that resilience back in those muscles.
And something to think about is remember that these are postural muscles. These are stabilizers that have to have some endurance. So if you're just doing that internal and external rotation with the arm down under no resistance for a period of 15 to 30 seconds, and they're getting tired, well, guess what? That's saying something. Those should be able to do that for minutes and minutes and minutes on end. Yeah, that's very little endurance, if any.
Yeah, exactly. Because basically those little rotator cuff muscles are designed to constantly be gently and subtly adjusting that humeral head in the glenoid fossa. So whatever that arm's doing in movement can happen while maintaining that integrity. So if they're getting fatigued after just a little bit of that, okay, we got some work to do here. But again, it's simple work. They can do that anywhere. Like people do that in the car, particularly on their, well, in America anyway, on their right side. Left side can be tricky depending on how your seat works. But basically just, take that, or take it standing in the shower, or take it before you brush your teeth. And just very gently getting that rotator cuff to start to have its integrity again.
I actually gave that exact exercise to my wife when she was working as an engineer. She was doing a lot of mousing and a lot of, fine
Yeah.
things at her desk, but she was, in a more hunched over position. She's got incredible posture, but she was noticing her shoulder wasn't feeling very good and it was sitting a little anterior. So I said, no resistance, just do internal and external rotation at your desk. Do 15 to 20 repetitions, just in and out, but keep it sort of in that socket and
Yeah.
just feel it stay there. And she was fatigued big time at first. But after a few weeks, she said, yeah, it's not bothering me anymore.
Yeah.
And I said, well, keep doing it.
Yep.
Keep doing it. Even though there's no resistance, it's just reminding those muscles where they want to be, reminding the bone, how is it sitting in the socket? And something that I think that we may want to mention is those muscles. But the muscles actually attach to the scapula and to the just outside of that humeral head. So they hold that in place. And like you said, every time we move the arm, they're helping us position those muscles are what's really positioning that ball into that socket properly.
Yep.
And I think that's important to remember. That's those muscles' jobs is positioning.
That's their whole job. And that's why they're tiny muscles. They're not tiny muscles, but they're not super big muscles. And they're right close. They're the closest muscles to the joint. So they have the best opportunity to both stabilize and gently position that, right? So that's really the rotator cuff's job. One thing we haven't mentioned so far is we talked a little bit about there's the infraspinatus, the teres minor on the back of the shoulder, the subscapularis underneath the shoulder that comes to the front, does internal rotation.
In the front.
Yeah. And then the other two are in the back and they do external rotation or lateral rotation. Then we have our supraspinatus. So yeah, exactly. Brian again is showing that on our YouTube, right? So that goes through into that subscapular fossa underneath the acromion and attaches to the top, more or less, of the humerus. So it really is a muscle that, again, as humans, when we're standing up, is the anti-gravity muscle. It holds that humeral head up and in.
Yep. And it's the one that whenever you hear about a tear or tendonitis or something, that's the one that usually has it because the muscles aren't balanced enough. So every time I try and abduct the arm, take the arm out to the side, it gets pinched off in that subacromial space. It pushes the bone, the humeral head, into the acromion. And, you can only bruise something so many times before there's going to be some damage.
Right.
So those other muscles aren't working hard enough.
Yeah. Well, they're just not doing their job, right?
Yep.
Or there's just not much space there. Like sometimes people have an acromion that's just very tight, like a hooked acromion. It just doesn't have a lot of room there. And if somebody who has that kind of structure where there's just not a lot of space there, then decides to become, a sheetrock layer or a swimmer, you got trouble because there's not enough space in there, right, for that tendon to not get smished every time that arm is up. So that's why you'll see, like, some people can do that job forever and some people can do that, any of those things for a short period of time, overhead work before they get real shoulder trouble. A lot of that's just structural stuff too.
Yep.
So in terms of that positioning of the head, that supraspinatus, its job, because it goes over that humeral head and kind of through that fossa, is to push that humeral head down slightly so that it doesn't bump up into that acromion when you lift up that arm. Yeah, because the deltoid, our bigger, more superficial muscle, is oftentimes the one that is lifting our arm up, right? And if the supraspinatus doesn't do its job, then that deltoid is going to pull that humeral head up into the acromion. Brian's showing it again. Very nice on our YouTube channel. This is all about the YouTube channel today. One other thing that I want to say, so I like, Brian, what you said about a pitcher losing that spring. One of the things that I use as my very first little warning shot of a rotator cuff problem is pain at the attachment of the deltoid. So oftentimes, if you take your hand on top of your arm and you kind of slide it down, you'll find about, I don't know, a third of the way down, there's like a little tender spot. And that's really where your deltoid, all three of your deltoid muscles of your shoulder attach. And I find if there is instability in the rotator cuff or trouble there, that'll be tender, and that's where they'll feel the pain. They won't feel it in the shoulder. They won't feel it in the rotator cuff. They'll feel it right there. And so if somebody says, God, I got a lot of pain right here, I'm like, okay, start doing internal external
Yep.
rotation
Yep.
today and keep that up. And because I find that I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. It's probably just a fascial connection into there, but that seems to be a really nice way to, as an early warning sign, and then take action on that early warning sign to minimize shoulder trouble.
What I found is there are referred pain signals that we see in the shoulder a lot. That's one of them that we see. And what's interesting is someone will come to me and say, I've got pain here, or I've got pain at the AC, basically right at the AC joint, almost at the coracoid process, or the anterior portion of the shoulder. They'll point there as well. And for me, just like you, done body work, before, I'll palpate the infraspinatus and say, that's not where it hurts, until I push just a little bit. And then they go, and immediately they'll pull away from me, and I'll say, okay, I think you might have some inflammation there. Something's telling me that there's something going on back there.
This isn't working.
Yeah, something's not working properly. But we do see those referred pain signals down the arm, down to the insertion point of the deltoid, the anterior portion. Rarely do we see them on the top where the supraspinatus is, or the back.
Yeah, very, 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 very uncommon.
Unless something pushes against them, and yet that's kind of what it needs, because those muscles need some blood supply to go to them. If they're not moving properly, having someone do some body work can actually be very beneficial. Getting the area to have a little bit more, blood flow to it can literally help. And even doing it to yourself, just massaging it yourself, or getting a ball against the wall, just anything that can do to get some blood flow to that area helps.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are some simple thoughts about glenohumeral congruency, or really maintaining that stability of the rotator cuff in the arm. And these are these are simple. Like if you've got a client with shoulder issues, just have them do either with the elbow bent or with the arm straight, just that medial lateral rotation. Just have them do that. And again, ideally maintaining that humeral head in the socket. One of the things, working with the doctors at sports medicine, like they always gave medial lateral rotation of the glenohumeral joint. That was always like where they started with any shoulder issue. That was like step number one. But if that humeral head was sliding around in the socket, you can do rotator cuff work all day and you won't get the best benefit. So that was one of those things I learned. It's like, okay, so I've got somebody who's really sloppy, because I worked with a lot of dancers and people that are hypermobile, or on the mobile side. If they weren't keeping that humeral head in place, they could go rolling back and forth with that rotator cuff all day long, and all they were doing was irritating it.
Yeah. No, it's got to have that congruency. You've got to keep it in the socket in order for the muscles to work properly, because if it's not, the muscles will never work properly.
No, and they're just going to slide. They're going to just, when you take those little tiny muscles and then you add the big muscles to it, add your deltoid to it, or you add your lat to it, or whatever, your something, right? That's just going to pull that humeral head farther out and hit it even more against either the acromion or the back of the joint or whatever, right? So those are not going to improve the congruency of that joint, because those big muscles are too superficial, right? They're just going to shove that humerus around, because that's kind of what they're designed to do.
And I like that you say to start without using any resistance, just letting it roll. And the reason I say that is, if I had, let's say, a heavy band, which is, most of the men are going to be, oh, that's too light, I got to have some resistance here. And they, put a heavy band there. Well, what do we see? We see protraction and retraction, the shoulder rolling forward as they come across the body. And as they externally rotate, they squeeze their shoulder blade back. Well, you know what? I can do all of this movement. I can do what? That's almost 30, 40 degrees. And I haven't moved. Yeah. And I haven't moved the humerus. It's only the scapula that's moving. So by training it with no resistance to start with, just to feel what it feels like, and then start with the lightest resistance, possible, where the lightest band, but still maintaining where you feel that congruency, feeling that bone staying in place. the thing I tell people is I don't want you to feel like you're squeezing your shoulder blade back or fixating your shoulder blade, because we don't want that. But we want you to keep it within the humerus. We want the humerus to be moving and not the whole shoulder unit.
Yep.
But we don't want fixation. We don't want you to squeeze everything else in place.
Just you just like that. The shoulder should be relatively relaxed, and you're just
Yeah.
moving that arm. Now, a little thing that I sometimes work with too is I take a water bottle and I half fill it up. This is, nice ones of these are the like a little little plastic ones. I've got a little metal one here, but basically, instead of doing that, I'm going to just basically take it and I'm just going to rotate. I'm getting myself in the picture here. Right. I'm just going to rotate that water bottle with the arm. There we go. And that's a really nice way just to get, just with the arm down, but again, I can't quite get in the picture there. And that adds a little bit of a dynamic action to it, which helps that rotator cuff to actually activate, because the rotator cuff responds to those changes in position. That's what it's designed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a little bit of like a half-filled water bottle there, then that's kind of dynamically moving and changing. And that rotator cuff has to respond to that change in resistance, that change in weight, that change in just where the force is coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that when you showed me that a while ago, I thought that was a really smart idea, because what also I think works great when it's half filled.
Yes. Half filled. You want it to be like slosh, slosh.
Bingo. It's the sloshing. It's because as something moves and it moves from one side to the other, your body has to sort of catch it. So there's a deceleration that occurs within the smaller muscles, because again, the water bottle might weigh half a pound. It's not going to weigh that much.
No.
But just allowing that motion and it catching it and then moving to the other side and catching it and catching it, it's decelerating and accelerating for both ends. And I like that. I think that's a great thing, because that's literally what we do all the time with our upper body. We have to, slow something down, speed something up. We're constantly doing that with our arm. So it's important to sort of train that aspect of it. And that's something that people forget about.
Yep. Yep. And it's, again, super simple. Everybody's got a little plastic water bottle or whatever. Now, that in some ways is the easy part.
Mm-hmm.
I find the scapula is, for many of us, a lifelong challenge of trying to figure out how to balance out the scapula.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a couple things I play with there, and Brian can certainly chime in here. So a couple things I play with there is, one is really being aware of what the two shoulders are doing. So really helping yourself to feel like, okay, in my case, my right shoulder goes back, my left shoulder rolls forward. Like that's just like how we go. Okay, so I'm thinking about trying to bring my left shoulder back a little bit. Now, I'm not mirrored in the video, so if you're watching the video, my rights and lefts are going to look confused. But basically, like bringing that shoulder blade back and down. Now, if I actually balance out my shoulder blades and feel them both in the same position, which I can find, my left one, which is the funky one, is like working like mad. Like I can just to hold that together, there's just some activity happening through my trapezius and through my lat and through serratus, other muscles, and sometimes just finding that and holding that, really feeling where the balance is an interesting place to start. And that'll often help to illuminate for you and for your client where the weakness is, like what's not working, and what movements are going to help to get that area a little bit more dynamically strong.
And it's in a postural position, so you're sitting upright. So it's not as though you have to have the person leaning forward or lying on their back or anything. So, they can do that at work. And it's something that's a smart idea that you can say, okay, I want you to do this once an hour and hold it for 10 seconds.
Right.
Just awareness. And I think that's a big key here for scapular work is the word awareness. Being aware of where your body is in space, even a little bit more than where you're currently at, can make a huge difference.
And that honestly is kind of the trick. Like, how do you help somebody become aware of where their scapula are? So I've done a few things. I've taken a video, especially if somebody's really uneven in how their scapula work. I'll take a video of the back body. And I'll show them. So I have them move in different ways. Like a classic one is bringing the arms up overhead. The scapula should ideally upwardly rotate. So the little
Yep.
bottom tip of the scapula should slide out to the side, upward thing goes up. And it's just, like bells ringing, right? It should like just open up. And when it does that appropriately and both sides are even, that's one thing. But a lot of times you'll see that one side moves faster, one side doesn't move as far, or one's totally stuck. And take a picture of that, and then they can start to see and feel what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to get people to, for me, it's all about motion sometimes, and
Yep.
just getting them to feel what good motion feels like. So what I like to do is putting them on a foam roller or half a foam roller, a spine fitter, or a rolled up towel, something that's going to elevate them slightly off of the ground so that their scapula has some movement.
Yeah. So allow their spine to be supported, but their scapula to be free.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then just have them do very small arm circles, arms straight in front of them, and have them do simple arm circles. Again, on YouTube, 45 minutes in, I'm showing small, and then investigate getting a little bigger and a little bigger. But what I find is interesting, the more we focus on something like that, the more their brain is going into their hands. They want to know where their hands are in space.
Yes.
So I redirect them back into their scapula, into their shoulders. What are your shoulder blades doing? Can you feel what they're doing? And I'll have them go a little bit bigger till whatever feels comfortable, as long as there's not a lot of noise or clunking or bumping or something or any pain. And then even arm scissors, take one overhead and one down by their side. What are you feeling? How do your shoulder blades feel? Do you feel like one of them's going into your ear and the other isn't? Again, redirecting their attention closer in to their body, closer into the scapula. Where are they feeling it in space? Because now if they're on their back, gravity is going to help pull their arm toward the ground when it goes overhead. Whereas if I'm sitting upright or standing, I'm fighting gravity, and the upper trapezius has a tendency to want to take over. So when they're lying on their back, they have a tendency that they get a little bit more freedom because gravity can assist them. And that just brings that awareness back to me.
Yeah, they also might be able to feel, especially I find this on a roller, spine fitters somewhat, but particularly on a roller, sometimes they can then feel how their shoulder blades are moving against that roller, right? So they can feel like, oh, this one's going like this one's going like this, that inner border. So anything you can do to enhance that proprioception, which you've talked about a lot before, for the shoulder is really a really critical thing. So one other piece on that. So that's all like open chain, moving, just playing with trying to get the movement patterns to happen in an appropriate way. And that can take a while, honestly. And that's a really key piece. I find with the scapula particularly, I look at improving movement patterns. And then I'll address muscles as I need to, but I don't really start with muscles. I start with movement patterns of the joints and then just build the muscles in as I go. One other way to play with this is closed chain. So basically in all fours position or a plank position, or with your hands in straps or on the foot bar or something, right? So their hands are on something. I find that's another place where you can play differently with how the scapula feel. If your hands are on the ground, or the foot bar, whatever it is, sometimes from there you can feel like, okay, what if I, with that connection into the palm, for example, really connect into that bottom part of the scapula, if that's where you're trying to connect to, which is often where I'm trying to connect to, right? And playing with how do you work the hand position even to get that connection through different parts of the shoulder.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see that. A lot of times when I have them do that, I'll have them do it against the wall to start with.
Yeah. Yep.
That way there's not a whole lot of resistance. They're not holding their body up, because even in quadruped, if you're on your hands and knees, there is some upper body. And if there's any discomfort, there's a little bit of effort in order just to maintain. Whereas I can put them against the wall and have them do a slight lean into the wall. And you can usually say, okay, how does this feel? And you can see, are they protracted? Are they retracted? Is one shoulder forward? Is one back? And then I can bring their mind again, their awareness into, okay, we need to bring your right scapula down a little bit. So let's just work, and I can gently assist, just very gently. My hand is there more as giving them additional proprioception because I want their muscles to do the work. So
Yeah.
it's just a little bit of here, let's pull this down here. And I'm barely touching them. I'm just guiding. And they go, oh, okay. I say, now, can you hold that? Can you just hold that position? Let's hold it for 10 seconds. Can you go a little longer? And you can see that they're there and they'll start to, their head will start going forward. Something else is going to compensate. And you have to watch their posture and everything, but you keep them for a little longer and a little bit longer. And I find that that's a great way to get them started on feeling that in a different position besides having their hands down by their side.
Absolutely.
And then I'll have them eventually work their way up the wall, you know, and that way we can see how are those scapula going out to the side? Are they going out? And if they're not, okay, where is it sticking? And maybe we'll just investigate that range of motion for now.
Nice.
You know,
nice.
Again, as we said, today we're talking more about mobility and more about movement. And I think maybe next episode, we can talk more about, you know, strengthening. Because I mean, strengthening the rotator cuff and strengthening the scapular stabilizers are incredibly important. But I think awareness, positioning, and keeping them moving are huge things that I don't think people think about first off.
No, and what I often find with the shoulder is if I correct to the best of my ability the movement patterns, I correct the joint actions, then the muscles will start to follow and they will start to do their job. If I start with just strength, like if I start with just rotator cuff work with a band or whatever, I do not get the same results because I'm not really addressing how the body is holding itself and how all those four joints are supporting themselves and working with each other. So, you know, it's like, this is an area where I've always got to look at the whole picture and I've always got to kind of get the pieces all working together. And that just takes a bit of time, a bit of effort, and a lot of awareness on the client's part. Because then, you know, like there's many, again, we're talking at the very beginning steps here, but finding that positioning can take weeks. I mean, honestly, really finding where that shoulder needs to be and then creating enough endurance to be able to actually maintain that position over a period of time can take even longer. So these are always things I find with the shoulder that, yes, we'll get into, certainly we'll get into some strengthening because I think that's really important to it, but choosing what strengthening you're doing and trying to maintain that integrity while you're strengthening it is really where the magic happens. But if they can find whatever that position is for their scapula and then keep that when they do like a chest press or they do a bicep curl, they do a row, and they can maintain that position, that's what we're looking for. That's when things really start to change.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking when people tend to go to physical therapy, the physical therapist has a limited amount of sessions and a limited amount of time to work with the person. So a lot of times it can feel almost like a shotgun approach of here are the exercises. We need to strengthen this as quickly as possible. Whereas I think us in the fitness and Pilates world, we have more time. We can work on movement. We can work on movement patterns. You know, unless it's a physical therapist who is getting paid cash, which is, in my opinion, the best because they can take as long as they need. The medical insurance industry isn't, you know, holding their generous. Yeah, they're not very generous, and they're kind of holding them hostage a little bit to a certain number of sessions. And we got to get, you know, they got to get out the door, you know, within those sessions and get them as good as possible. Whereas we have a little bit more time. And I find that that can be very beneficial for us. And I think especially in Pilates, they're used to moving slower, smaller, and more body awareness than in fitness, where people are thinking about more gross motor movement. They're thinking about, you know, being able to lift weights, being able to move weight around. I think in the Pilates world, it's a lot easier to have them do smaller movements and work on awareness. And I think that's a benefit to Pilates.
Yeah, I mean, that's I've worked with a ton of people with shoulder stuff, and they mostly seem to appreciate it. It seems to actually work, and takes time, but it also, I mean, honestly, a lot of people that came to me with shoulder stuff had been to PTs, they'd been to doctors, they'd been to, you know, a lot of other practitioners who weren't managing the problem.
Right.
And a lot of it is like we have the luxury, and it is absolute luxury. Do not get me wrong. I completely appreciate it. Right. To see a
Mm-hmm.
client for an extended period of time, for a whole hour, and to really focus on what they need to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I often say I'm kind of glad I never became a physical therapist because, you know, again, unless you're in a cash practice and people are paying you a whole lot of money, 15 minutes at Kaiser or whatever to diagnose and work with a shoulder, eh,
Yeah.
good luck. Like I have
Yeah.
a lot of sympathy for the challenges of that. They're huge.
Yeah.
And you know, and when people complained about it, it's like, look at if I couldn't do that, I couldn't make somebody better in 6 sessions of 15 minutes each.
Nope. No
When I'm
way.
seeing
No
eight,
way.
you know, 12 or 16 or 20 clients a day, that's not going to happen.
No.
So, you
No.
know, I'm very happy, and I feel very privileged to be able to do the work at the level I've been able to do it because I'm in the Pilates environment and people are paying cash. At least most of them are.
Yeah. I love that you said it's a luxury because it really is.
It's a
And
luxury.
I've told that to a lot of people when they come to me. They say, well, what's the difference? I said, I have time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have time that I can take. And if it takes me 6 weeks, it takes me 6 weeks. If it takes 6 months, it takes 6 months. Your body's going to only heal and do what it wants to do in its time.
Absolutely.
And you can't force it. And
Nope.
unfortunately, you know, hate to say this, but the medical insurance industry believes that you can
Yes.
rush through it.
Yeah.
And some people will respond that way, but I find not everybody that comes to me does. And it
Right.
just takes the time that it takes.
Yep. If they get to me, it's usually because something has not worked. Right.
Exactly.
I mean, not always. Sometimes when they know me well, they're an old term client. They show up with a problem because they know I can work with them.
Yep.
But you know, so many of my clients came because they had tried a chiropractor and a massage therapist and a physical therapist, and they'd been to the, you know, like, and then they show
Yeah.
up at me as kind of like a last resort. You know, I was
Mm-hmm.
very, I'm sure you're often the last resort as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
And all I can say is I'm going to do my best. I don't know any more than anybody else you've seen, but to your point, I have the time. And
Yes.
if movement is the tool, I have the tool,
Yeah.
right? Because sometimes
Yeah.
movement isn't the tool. Sometimes they need surgery or they need manual therapy or something. Those are great. But my tool is movement. And if that's really what you need, I've got the time to figure out how to do that best.
And it's not just movement of, let's say, the glenohumeral joint, but it could be the scapula. It could be the ribs.
It could be
It could
the
be the
thoracic.
neck.
It could
It
be
could
the
be thoracic.
cervical spine.
It could be
It could be the
anything.
wrist, like it could be it could be like scoliosis in the lumbar,
Yep.
right? I mean, it can be all kinds of things that they're not generally going to be able to address, you know, in a six week, 6 session, 15-minute
Yep.
or 20-minute session.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas we have the time and we can work with the whole body. We're
Yeah,
not limited to a
exactly.
script saying just work the rotator cuff. It's like, oh,
No,
but did you notice that everything's rolled forward on that side and
right.
your ribs aren't moving? You're not breathing very well. And, you know, your neck muscles are overinflamed because, you know, your ribs are going, there's so many other things that we can see that we're like, well, maybe that's just one symptom
Exactly.
of a bigger picture
Yep.
that we're able to work with because we have the time, we have that luxury.
Yeah. Yeah. So there is our introduction to the shoulder. Yeah,
Yes.
a little bit of glenohumeral congruency, talking at least in general terms about stabilizing the scapula. And again, not stabilizing it as in lock and load, but
Right.
stabilizing it in that it's moving appropriately with support for whatever is required of it, because that's a really different idea than just scapular stability staying in place.
Right. And that's the thing that we need to, I think, go into a little bit of detail on in subsequent episodes is what is proper movement. And when we talk about scapular stability, it's not lock and load. It's not hold it in place, don't let it move. It's about proper movement.
Yep.
It's about making sure the right muscles are working at the right sequence and the right timing.
Yep.
And that can be a little bit more complex.
Yep.
So
we'll
that
have
leaves
some
us
fun
for,
with that.
yeah, we have many episodes that we could talk about that on. This is awesome.
There's always more.
There's always more. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Again, do us a favor if you're enjoying this, hit the like, hit the follow button on the platform of your choice. You can always reach out to us on movingcombos@gmail.com, or on our Instagram, Moving Combos, or on Nora's or my Instagram. Facebook, it's Moving Convos as well, or Moving Conversations. Yeah, so I think we have a few things that we can talk
YouTube is
about.
under you. YouTube is under Brian Richey. So since we
Yes,
did a lot of
YouTube is under
YouTube
me.
stuff today, yeah. I just wanted
Yes,
to
absolutely.
get that out.
Go to my YouTube page. If you just type in Brian Richey, Richey, it'll pop up, and you'll see all of our back episodes as well. We have a tendency to be a little bit more animated when you see us live and in person. So this is a great way to be able to see that. And for those of you who are in other countries who may be struggling with the English, you can always turn on the closed captioning and it'll translate it as good as AI will.
Yeah, exactly. Which hopefully will get better, but it could be a little funky, but you'll do your best.
Exactly. Well, thank you for joining us. And from Nora St. John, I'm Brian Richey. We'll see you guys next week.
Bye, guys.